In the summer of 1991, the former TV program World Monitor sent a four-person crew from the East Coast to interview me in the field at Fort Ross. The producer had phoned a few weeks earlier to set up the interview. She told me that they wanted to film a 5-minute-long segment for the news show. World Monitor replaced a Christian Science Monitor report in 1988. World Monitor was a daily television program anchored by former NBC correspondent John Hart. It was originally shown on the Discovery Channel, but on May 1, 1991, just before my interview, it moved to the newly created Monitor Channel, a 24-hour news and information service. Programming for World Monitor came from the channel's TV station in Boston and was carried nationally. In 1992, after only 11 months in operation, the Monitor Channel was shut down after suffering substantial financial losses. The producer had hired the late and legendary Robert Pierpoint to conduct the interview. Bob had been one of my favorite correspondents when I was growing up, so I looked forward to meeting him. Although he had retired quite a few years earlier, Bob and his wife were then living in Bodega Bay, just 20 miles or so down Highway 1 from Fort Ross. The producer at World Monitor managed to hire Bob to handle the on-screen interviews for her story about Fort Ross. Robert Pierpoint was a legendary journalist for CBS News, often reporting for the CBS News of Walter Cronkite and on the magazine-type program Sunday Morning with Charles Kuralt. After joining CBS and becoming one of their White House correspondents, Pierpoint covered 6 U.S. presidents, from Dwight D. Eisenhower to Jimmy Carter. Before joining CBS, Bob had covered the Korean War. He's remembered as having brought a human interest touch to that war. On November 18, 1951, one of Bob's reports from Korea appeared on the first edition of the award-winning See It Now, a news and documentary series hosted by Edward R. Murrow and broadcast by CBS from 1951 to 1958. Murrow hired Bob as a correspondent for his program. On December 29, 1953, Bob made another memorable appearance on See It Now, as part of the edition Christmas in Korea. For this episode, Bob took the lead role in interviewing U.S. soldiers and some Ethiopian soldiers that were stationed in Korea as well. In a recreation of Bob's See It Now role, his voice played a central part in Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, the final episode of MASH, the popular TV show set in Korea during the war. In this final episode, from 1983, it's Bob's voice you hear on the radio announcing the ceasefire that would mark the end of the war. This final episode of MASH is thought to have been the most watched show in history. Nielsen estimated the audience at 125 million viewers. Bob reported from Korea throughout the conflict, occasionally on television, but mostly on CBS radio for World News Roundup. But it was his role in covering political wars that most of us remember. He was there in Dallas with President John F. Kennedy that fateful day in 1963, and he covered Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, and so much more. So you can imagine my excitement when I learned that Bob would be interviewing me. He was a legend. On my way to Fort Ross to meet with Bob and the film crew, I first had to stop and attend a meeting. It was an important meeting and one for which I chose to wear a sports jacket and tie. That wasn't my normal, typical attire as a working archaeologist, but there were occasionally times when I had to dress up. Following my meeting, I continued on to Fort Ross, still wearing my fancy duds. Upon arriving at Fort Ross, I met up with the producer and her crew in the parking lot. She looked at me, looked troubled, and then politely asked if I had any other clothes I could change into. I was still wearing my sports coat and tie. She wanted me to wear what she thought to be more typical of an archaeologist. You know, archaeology attire. Fortunately, I had some field clothes in my car, which I gladly changed into. I put on some well-worn jeans and a plain work shirt. I think it was green. When I reemerged from the changing room, I looked more like an archaeologist than I had in the fancy jacket and tie. When Bob arrived, he was wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. That's when I understood. The producer was going for a certain look, and she couldn't have the archaeologist overdressed when she was wanting a much different look. And she certainly didn't want me to be seen all dressed up when Bob was sporting jeans and a plaid shirt. Bob interviewed me in the park's visitor center. We were seated a few feet apart, and the interview seemed more like a conversation you might have with an old friend. I talked about the importance of preserving places like Fort Ross, the place the Kushaya Pomo called Matini. The Kushaya are the native inhabitants of this part of the world. They allowed the Russians to create the settlement we now know as Fort Ross. I seem to recall that I talked about the Kushaya too. After my interview, Bob interviewed the late Dan Murrow, one of the state park rangers assigned to Fort Ross. Dan was one of the state's great interpreters, and he was a wealth of information about Fort Ross, especially the site's Alaskan native history. The Russians had brought a large contingent of Alaskan men to hunt sea otters at Fort Ross. Some may have come willingly, but most were forced to participate. The dynamics that existed between the Russians, native Alaskans, and native Californians at Fort Ross was one of Dan's areas of interest, and he discussed these dynamics with Bob. After concluding his interview with Dan, we led Bob and the World Monitor crew on a walking tour of the park, starting with the Russian compound. After looking at the various structures inside the compound, we strolled through the main sally port and walked out onto the coastal terrace. That's where the Alaskan natives had their dwellings. In the distance, we could see archaeologists busy at work on a dig. This was the archaeological field class from the University of California at Berkeley, taught by my friend and colleague, Professor Kent Lightfoot. There were about 30 students and TAs in the class, and all of them were hunched over their respective excavation units, carefully digging down through the layers of history. With Bob and the film crew in tow, Dan and I walked over to the dig. Bob enjoyed watching the archaeologists at work. Some of them were exposing an impressive bone bed, a concentration of mostly sea mammal bones derived from butchering activity. It was impressive to see, and it impressed Bob. Professor Tom Wake, now of UCLA, was then a graduate student at Berkeley and a TA in Kent Lightfoot's class. Tom took the lead of explaining to Bob what was being found that day. The World Monitor crew got it all on film. Looking back, I'm sure glad I had the old clothes to change into. The interview turned out nice. In fact, it proved to be one of my all-time favorite on-screen interviews. Anyone who remembers Bob knows that he was one of the best. Robert Pierpoint died in 2011 in Santa Barbara from complications related to hip surgery. He was 86. He was one of the greats, along with the likes of Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite. I think we need journalists like the three of them more than ever today.